take your passport with you.
I've been waiting, it's about 6 months now for my new passport. So
I'm going to let our guests in if that's okay.
yeah, go ahead.
No, it's interesting, Robert and Derek. I stay pretty close, as I'm sure you do, Derek, on what's going on. And apparently, if you are an American and are able to travel to an international destination, in order to get back, you actually have to prove that not only are you fully vaccinated, but you have to prove that you've had a timely negative coronavirus 19 test before you get on the airplane to fly
Yeah,
home.
I think it's 24 to 48 hours before. My daughter just came back from Mexico, and the hotel provides a place to get your test before you, day before you leave or something.
Yeah, that's is about as rigorous a requirement as the CDC has recommended for good notice, although it continues to be a problem in getting American citizens who don't travel internationally vaccinated, and yet they're focusing on this very small number of people who travel abroad and then come home with very stringent requirements, no questions asked, and actually, as far as I can tell from the CDC, at least beginning of the week, no objections from people citing freedom to act the way they want to. You either follow it or you get stranded. So.
Gentlemen, it's 11 o'clock.
Okay. Anytime you're ready, Robert.
Okay, I am ready. Am I on for everybody? On behalf of SPICE and the SPICE committee, we welcome everybody today to I anticipate to be a very informative program of interest to
You should have made
a
it
lot of
louder,
people.
but I'm afraid to leave. I don't, if I leave, it's not going to come.
Hello? Just want to remind everybody of a few things. Our November programs, November 3rd, we have Jewish themes in Broadway musical with a distinguished rabbi from Toronto doing a program on Children of Eden. I've seen the program, it's absolutely marvelous. And then November 7th, Thanksgiving and American Sukkot with Rabbi Nichols. Also should be a very good program. Just want to remind everybody, on Monday, you got the email from the temple with the ability to sign up for the SAGE program. So look at your email, go ahead and register. It should be a very good program by Rabbi Knight on Israelis and Palestinian relationships. So make sure you register for that. And with those brief announcements, I'd like to turn the program over to Michael Norman to introduce our esteemed guest today.
Thank you, Robert. I hope you all can hear me. I actually have two introductions for Dr. Raghavan. One you probably have seen on the screen and also in Spice News. He is a distinguished academic medical oncologist. He's been with us for 10 years, came from the Cleveland Clinic and has worked very well and very effectively in not only improving quality of care, but also the access to care in terms of the distance to clinical and research sites, access, and culture. The other introduction is, I think, sort of bespeaks who Dr. Raghavan is as a person. And so I will indicate to you in inverted commas what he said. Derek Raghavan, a member of Temple Beth El, works at Levine Cancer Institute. Obviously, he's president. He has been in many places, so many places that he cannot hold a job, but he is here to talk to us about the work that's being done by his team in Charlotte. You also need to know that he's recently stepped down as chair of the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra, so please don't call him for great tickets anymore. And with that introduction, I'm delighted and honored to introduce Derek Raghavan to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Michael said, I am part of the congregation, and it's nice to be introduced by someone who has contributed so much to medical care in North Carolina prior to his retirement. So a pleasure to be here. This first slide just shows you what the main branch of the Levine Cancer Institute looks like today. We're very indebted to many members of the Temple Beth El and Temple Israel congregations, most particularly Leon and Sandra Levine, who've donated a tremendous amount of money to allow us to build these facilities and 25 other branches throughout North Carolina and South Carolina. And we now have a new branch in Georgia. The Levine Foundation have been really seminal in helping to shape the program. And one of our congregation, Larry Polsky, who recently retired as senior advisor to Leon, has been a great source of counsel and advice to me. And I just wanted to acknowledge that as I get started. So this is what I thought I would talk about today. We Australians are a funny bunch. We tend to view people such as the members of the SPICE program as being able to read. And so you'll find that unlike most physicians who give lectures in the USA, I'm not going to read every slide line by line, but simply leave them there for you to have a quick look. And that just is economical in terms of time. So this is really what I wanted to start with. Now, of course, I recognize that most of you are really highly educated and know about cancer, but I always find that it's just useful for a moment, just in case someone has always kind of wondered about the detail. Now, you have to understand Michael Norman's specialty, even though he was legendary in his field, surgical types don't really know that much about medicine. So if nothing else, I'm putting this up just to remind Michael of what cancer was in the days when he tried to avoid it as much as he could. So basically, it's uncontrolled growth of cells. And I think about cancer a little bit like rabbits. Nobody has given rabbits a book on how to stop procreation, and so they just keep producing more little rabbits. And if you think about a room with rabbits procreating, eventually they burst through the door because there are just too many of them to stay in the one room. And that's kind of not unlike the way cancer is. It has uncontrolled growth of cells. It expands and damages local tissues. And then the one thing that rabbits don't do, but cancer does, is it can actually, a bit like the US Corps of Engineers in the military, it can attract its own supply mechanism. So if you think about an army that builds a road to bring supplies into the army up at the front, cancer is very much like that. It can actually attract its own blood supply. And we can use that diagnostically by using tests that identify increases in blood vessels. One of the bad things about cancer is it competes very effectively for nutrition. And those of you who've seen movies about people who've not done well with cancer will notice that they sometimes will lose a lot of weight. And that's because they're actually competing less effectively than the cancer for the use of nutrition. And then, as I've shown on the slide, some cancers have the potential to spread to other parts of the body. I thought it might be helpful just to let you take a look at kind of what cancer looks like. So in the top left of the slide, you can see a very orderly pattern of little structures with a little dark center. The dark center is what we in science call the nucleus. And so normal tissues are very well ordered. That's actually why if any of us go and jump into a swimming pool, we don't get waterlogged, because the cells are arranged, they have borders that get stuck to each other. And if you look at that cartoon in the middle, you can see some cells that are all higgledy-piggledy and disrupted. And in fact, to the right, I've shown you a picture looking down a microscope of what cancer looks like. So you can see, instead of a very even, orderly pattern, the cells are kind of all over the place. In the bottom left of this slide, I've just put an illustration in that shows blood vessels growing into a cancer. And the cancer actually releases substances that attract the blood vessels in. And so the blood vessels carry oxygen and nutrition into the cancer. And then just for interest, if you wondered ever what the nucleus looks like and what a cancer looks like, there's a blow up there, what we call an electron micrograph, that's about 20, 30,000 times the blow up of what a cancer cell looks like. This chart is here just to remind me that one huge area of progress in the last 15 or thereabouts years has been in our understanding of what causes cancer to occur. And the whole story, if I wanted to give you one word as a summary of where progress has been, the whole story is in our understanding of genes. The genes are the substance of life made up of DNA. They allow me to transmit my dark hair and rugged good looks to my granddaughter. I've failed to do that to my grandson, who is blonde and has blue eyes, much like his father. So the genes don't always run true. And on the left of this slide, you can see I've just listed a bunch of genes that are associated with the development of colon cancer. Now, those of you who have had the extreme delight of having a colonoscopy done, which is a procedure where they make you drink a bunch of goop the night before, you then try not to fall asleep in the toilet overnight, because the idea is to empty your bowel of its contents, and then a wonderful gastroenterologist puts you to sleep and sticks a sort of snake-like gadget up your rear end. It has a camera on it, and lo and behold, it will take pictures of what the gastroenterologist sees inside. Now, in the top right hand of this slide, if you look very carefully, at the bottom of that picture, it's what we call a micrograph of a colonic or colon polyp. A polyp is a little cauliflower-like thing that comes out of the lining of the bowel or the colon. At the bottom, you can see a very ordered pattern, and that's what a normal colon looks like. If you look at the top, it's really dark, sort of dark purpley and higgledy-piggledy, and you can see it sort of comes into a little stalk area. So this is the reason that colonoscopy is so important. A gastroenterologist, much like a cowboy lassoing a steer, can put a little rope, electronic rope, around the stalk of that piece of cauliflower, cinch it, and cut it off. The reason it doesn't hurt is the bowel doesn't have the type of pain receptor that will feel that occurring. And this is brilliant, because in this picture here, there is a cancer right at the top that is beginning to develop in this colonic polyp. It hasn't invaded into the wall of the bowel. And so by having a colonoscopy, we can actually identify, diagnose, and treat an early colon cancer without having to do major surgery. And the reason this is so important is that the Ashkenazi Jewish population, unfortunately, have a bunch of the mutations in DNA I've shown on the left-hand side. And so Ashkenazi Jews have a higher risk of getting colon cancer. And so as you get older, and particularly if you have a family history of colon or bowel cancer, it's really important to see a gastroenterologist and arrange to have these tests done from time to time. I mentioned that genes basically cause cancer. They are responsible for two things. We have what are called oncogenes, and they will be genes that are mutated. So there is a change, and I'll show you why those changes occur in a moment. There will be a change that occurs in the DNA that will actually stimulate cancer growth. And then there are suppressor genes, and they're genes that actually act like policemen of the body, and they stop cancer from growing. And so in them, They're terrific to have, the suppressor genes. The one at the bottom, the P53 gene, is a great gene to have working properly because it stops cancer. But if something happens to that gene, so for example, if you're exposed to a large dose of radiation, if you're exposed to cigarette smoke on a regular basis, that P53 gene will mutate. What that means is it chemically changes its structure and it stops working. So it stops suppressing cancer from occurring. So it's a bad thing for that to happen. I've just listed here on this slide a picture that shows you the various common cancers, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see the ones that are pretty common. And in fact, in the Charlotte community, these cancers are the ones that we see most commonly. As you can see, if you add the figures there, approximately 1.5 million new cancers per year. And at the Levine Cancer Institute, we are now seeing a bit over 20,000 new cases a year. So we're seeing about 1% of America's cancers each year. So we're really quite busy. So one of the things that I think when I've got a captive audience and you're trapped at home and you may think you can leave, but in fact, Rabbi Asher has locked the doors to your house. So you're stuck here until I finish talking. I'm sorry, it's just something that Asher and I figured out, which would be to keep you here if I was boring. So I think it's useful when I've got you captive to help you to avoid cancer if possible. And there are a couple of things there that you look at and say, really, do we need to be reminded, smoking and excessive sun exposure? Obviously, everybody listening to me has known that forever. What isn't so well known, because we didn't actually know it 5 years ago, is that chronic obesity has become one of the new common causes associated with cancer. It's not associated with every cancer, but if you are chronically obese, and you already know that puts you at risk of diabetes and hypertension or high blood pressure or heart disease, actually turns out it puts you at increased risk for breast cancer, colon cancer, and prostate cancer. Now, that doesn't mean if you happen to be chubby, you're definitely going to get cancer. It simply means you are at increased risk. Now, we can do something about it. I'm 72 years old. When I was 67, I was blackmailed into performing for the Charlotte Ballet in Dancing with the Stars. And I spent 3 months rehearsing to dance in front of a bunch of people who threw things at me. I will comment, I raised nearly $500,000. So it couldn't have, look, it was a sympathy vote. They threw money at me. But in the practice sessions, I dropped my weight by 25 pounds and I've kept it off. And so every morning, the lovely Judy, the second of my many wives, puts up with me. She gives me breakfast. Well, actually, she lets me get my own breakfast. And then I go down to the gym and run 5 miles, and I've kept my weight off. And so that's my way of trying to protect myself. I'm lucky because I'm swarthy and dark. So the risks for me of sun exposure are not that bad, and I've never smoked. It is important to understand that family history and genes matter. I'm always amazed when I meet someone who says, yeah, I've just arrived and I've got this big mass in my breast. And I say, well, I'm sorry, we need to investigate that. And they'll say, yeah, what do you think it could be? And I'll say, well, it could be many things, but it might be a type of breast cancer. And they'll look surprised and I'll say, do you know anyone in the family who's had breast cancer? And they'll say, oh yeah, my auntie and my mom and my grandmother and 2 cousins. And I'm surprised that somehow there's a disconnect and people don't actually say, if I have many people in the family who've had breast cancer or colon cancer or prostate cancer, maybe I should do something to avoid it. Maybe I should get checked to diagnose it early. I've listed some of the other causes there. I think I won't go through the whole list. They're all pretty self-evident. Radiation is worth mentioning. I think if you live in a house at ground zero, in other words, on the ground, it's probably worth having a radon check. Radon is a gas that is released from the ground. It's radioactive, and there are ways of getting rid of it from your house. I happen to live in an apartment block on the top floor, and even I had our house checked for radon. We fortunately don't have it, but I have certainly heard of apartment blocks where people on the 3rd or 4th floor will have some radon there, and it probably is being released from the material that was used to construct the building. Some types of chemotherapy can cause cancer either directly, they have carcinogenic, that means cancer-causing properties, or they can sometimes affect the immunity. And I'll talk to you in a few minutes about how we at the Levine Cancer Institute address that and cover our patients so that we actually look to see if they're at risk. And then some of the viruses out there, particularly the HIV virus, which causes immune deficits. And then one that you've been perhaps seeing advertised on TV recently, the human papilloma virus, which you will see advertisements telling us to get our kids, excuse me, vaccinated. Cell phones, I wish I knew the answer. I don't. There's evidence that suggests they may be associated with one type of brain cancer. There are other equally strong studies that say there's no connection. So really what I do, if I'm talking on my cell phone, I'll hold it out here rather than putting it straight next to my face. And that's not based on evidence that's saying, since I don't know, why take the risk? And then one of the things that is scary, and you won't be surprised about this because it's been on the news, quite sensibly, people have been avoiding doctors and hospitals because they recognize that we're at increased risk of having and carrying COVID. But that has actually caused people to stay away from hospitals, not get their mammograms or their colonoscopies or skin checks. And so we're actually seeing an epidemic now after 18 months of COVID of people who are presenting with more advanced cancers than we would have seen in the past, which is a shame. So let's move forward a little bit. And here I've just sort of summarized what I think we should be doing. And so this is basically the credo or the mantra of the Levine Cancer Institute. We cure when we can, we maximize length and quality of life, we do science. And part of looking after people with cancer is actually to look after the person, not just the cancer, and look after their family. And as I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cost, because it's becoming a really big deal in the United States particularly, and I want to chat about that. So thinking about how progress is being made, all of this sort of comes together. I've put in red here the importance of the immune system, and that is going through a renaissance at the moment. And I can't give you a better example, I don't think, than if you think about President Jimmy Carter. President Carter, I have no opinion on whether he was a fabulous president or a terrible president. He was certainly a super nice guy and continues to be so. I was distressed several years ago to hear that he had been diagnosed in Georgia with a malignant melanoma that had spread to his liver and to his brain. This is no HIPAA violation, it was in every newspaper. Jimmy Carter is still alive. I think it's 5 years now, and that's predicated on the fact that we have identified that there are inhibitors, what we call checkpoint inhibitors, that stop the body's immune system acting as a policeman to kill cancer cells when they form. And we now have drugs available to interfere with that blockage. We can actually unblock the immune system, and that in fact causes the body to reject certain cancers, most particularly melanoma and kidney cancer. And now there are pretty good data to suggest that this same process will improve outcomes in cancers of the throat and in lung cancer. So this has been a really big deal in the last few years. We also have learned how to stop the process of blood vessels cancers attracting blood vessels in. And then we've also discovered how to turn off the oncogenes that I talked to you about a few moments ago and how to interfere with the blockade of suppressor genes. So we're actually targeting some of the genes that cause cancer. So one of the things that I think is handy about having a cancer institute in your backyard is we have the opportunity as part of treating our patients to bring science into the clinic. And I've given you a couple of examples here. I've talked to you already about genes. We have a big lab run by Dr. Belinda Avalos, who I recruited some years ago from the Ohio State Cancer Center, University Cancer Center. And her lab, in association with a scientist called Larry Druhan, has been looking at how do normal blood cells change to become leukemic blood cells. A couple of other examples, the head of our solid tumor oncology team, Dr. Antoinette Tan, who joined me from the Robert Wood Johnson Cancer Institute in New Jersey. Antoinette is an international figure in the management of triple negative breast cancer. What that means is there are types of breast cancer that show characteristics that indicate that they're either risky and are likely to be aggressive, or they're likely not to be very aggressive. For example, hormones can get in and either encourage or block breast cancer from growing, and there are receptors. These are tissues that actually suck in hormones or hormone blockers on the surface of breast cancer cells. If those receptors don't exist, that goes into the double negative breast cancer domain. And then there's one other gene that we can measure that is a good gene to have. If it's not there, that then creates triple negative breast cancer. And so Antoinette has actually recently published a book on this. She's got clinical trials going, and her trials are focused on using gene targeting to get control of breast cancer. If you watch the evening news, you'll often see advertisements of people with metastatic breast cancer who are talking about the fact they have a new lease of life, and it's mostly these targeted therapies that are being advertised. I have a nationally known figure, Dr. Asim Amin, who has been focusing on checkpoint inhibition. To remind you, that's the term I use to talk about blocking immunity. So Asim was, in fact, one of the team that helped to develop some of the drugs that have ultimately helped Jimmy Carter in his battle against cancer. And those genes are the ones that control immunity. There is another group of genes, the RAF, as I've listed there, family of genes, which are oncogenes that stimulate growth, and we've now learned ways of blocking them from stimulating growth. I mentioned how expensive cancer care has become, and I just want to touch on that because this is going to be something that you will hear about more and more and more. We've always looked at what we call the toxicity of cancer care. Toxicity meaning the side effects of cancer care. If you get chemotherapy, if it's given poorly, you'll be nauseated, you may not be able to stand up, and so on. That's a side effect of chemotherapy, and there are ways of addressing it. The most rapidly growing side effect of having cancer is actually a term that we call fiscal toxicity. It actually means people are mortgaging their houses to pay the bills. I'll show you in a second why this happens. It's driven by a bunch of different things. And we might all say, well, I've got great insurance, but I would put a cautionary note in. You guys are all able to elect politicians, and we need to be talking to our politicians about it because it's a big deal. Some of the new treatments are being sold by the pharmaceutical companies for $500,000 or $1 million. So if you have a 10% copay, that could be $50,000 to $100,000 that you suddenly have to find. And so we need to be thinking very carefully about how as a nation we address this. Now, I've summarized here the causes. Let me be clear. I don't want to just point the finger at everyone else. Healthcare systems and doctors are part of the deal, but there are a number of other drivers. There's general inflation. Small amount is fraud and abuse. Unfortunately, and I actually disagree with this slide, and I have data to support my opinion, I think it's a lot more than 7% of costs that come out of litigation and risk management. People these days will sue for everything. And, I think it's perfectly appropriate to sue a bad hospital or a bad doctor. I think it's not so appropriate just to initiate litigation because things didn't work well and you thought you might get some money back, and that's pushing the cost of care up. There's no question that the Hospital Association and the Pharmaceutical Association are two of the biggest lobby people in Washington, D.C. and in the state government houses. And they spend an awful lot of money lobbying government to look the other way in terms of cost escalation. And right up there with them are the various health insurance plans. They will lobby government to allow them to get away with things that they shouldn't really be doing. So we as a community need to be thinking about this because it will affect us as we get older, but it will also affect our children if this isn't managed. And I think this is a really important slide that I'm showing you. In the red is the blowout and cost in the United States. And look at all the countries where there has been increment, but nothing like what's happening in the USA. We pay more for healthcare than any other country. And that would be terrific if we had way better results. I've practiced in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the USA, and our outcomes are not that different. Maybe a little better. We do a lot more research here, but the fact of the matter is we're paying for something that is not that different from having cancer in Britain or France or somewhere like that. So we need to be aware of it. It's a shared responsibility, and here are some of the things that are important. There was recently enacted a legislation that was called the Right to Try legislation. And in principle, I support it because I think every patient should be allowed to at least have a discussion that says, if you run out of options, let me try something else. Let me take the risk. But I think we also have to understand that having, as I said, practiced elsewhere, what's unique about the USA is we view death as being un-American. We will do anything we can to stop death. We'll try any drug. And I think at some point, that's what's pushing the costs up in part. There are times when you simply have to say, we've done the best we can, it isn't working, and maybe it's time to step back and not keep going through treatment and tests and needles and so on. So in fact, at the Levine, we've created a mechanism so that anybody who's got a poor chance of success will be asked to chat to a palliative medicine physician. It doesn't mean we're giving up on them, but it gives them the opportunity to look at other ways of approaching things, maybe take a break from treatment. And then I've listed some of the other things that push costs up. I'm very influenced by a guy called Mike Porter. When I was at the Cleveland Clinic, Toby Cosgrove, who was the CEO there, arranged for all the clinical leaders, so the head of medicine, surgery, the cancer center, to meet over about 18 months with Mike Porter, who wrote this wonderful book. If you happen to be interested in health policy and the costs of care, it's a great book. So Mike Norman might enjoy reading it. If Rabbi Asher is listening, it would probably put him into a coma because it's way too technical. It doesn't relate to the broader community involvement, but it has some great principles in it, which I've summarized here. And the reason that I've put this together for you is I basically came here from Cleveland 10 years ago to set up a new cancer center. And being a disciple of Mike Porter and Elizabeth Teesberg, I actually created the Levine based on these principles, providing good information and support for physicians, restructuring the relationship between the providers and the way health occurred so that my doctors are not incentivized to see more patients and more patients and more patients and do more chemotherapy. They're actually incentivized to offer clinical trials, to manage patient complications, to educate the community, to do many things beyond just giving chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And so I think this concept of rethinking how healthcare should be managed has been really important to the genesis of the Levine Cancer Institute. I've summarized here how we think about cancer, and I think this little cartoon really says it all. Where you live should not determine how you fight cancer, and that's so important. You know, if you live in Charlotte, surrounded by good hospitals like Novant and like Carolina's Medical Center or Atrium Health, you're going to get great care because it's just down the road. In the past, if you lived in Shelby or Lincolnton or Macon, Georgia, your results statistically would be worse because you were further away. It was hard, particularly if you were sick, to get to a major center. The doctors who were terrific in your area didn't have the wherewithal to get you involved in cancer trials. And often, I think there are lots of data to suggest that if you're involved in cancer trials, your results, quality of care and the results will be better. So we basically set up a system that has multiple sites. We now have our 26th branch of the Levine Cancer Institute is being opened this coming year in Macon, Georgia. And we have a branch over near Whiteville, North Carolina. We've got branches in Lincolnton, Rutherfordton, Shelby, Rock Hill. And so we've spread out so that people don't have to travel to get their care. This concept was actually written about by Andy Abraham and Brad Dimmock, who are two surgeons from the University of Michigan, when they were looking at new models of cancer care. And this chart actually shows what they described in the New England, one of the New England Journal of Medicine subjournals. So they basically used the Levine Cancer Institute as a prototype of how to manage cancer in the future. And as you can see, rather than having everybody centralized to downtown Charlotte, what we've done is we've spread out throughout 3 states and make it easier for patients to get access to everything we do pretty much close to home. To do that, I did a major recruitment program. You remember I told you I lost 25 pounds? That was because I gained 25 pounds. Michael knows when you're recruiting people, you have to take them out to dinner and make them feel good about themselves. So every dinner is about an extra 100 calories. So I've recruited more than 100 people to Charlotte. This is my leadership group. And I'm actually kind of excited about it. I'm just showing you the places. You can see there the places I've recruited people from, or I should say grammatically correctly, from where I have recruited them. The 3 in yellow I'm particularly proud of. I've been able to keep my faculty over a 10-year period. But Ed Kim, who was my chair of solid tumor oncology, absolutely brilliant physician and international figure in lung cancer, several other things, just recently took a job as physician-in-chief at the City of Hope Cancer Center in Los Angeles. And he's doing what I did here. He's actually building a new hospital down in Orange County. John Gerber, about 3 years ago, I recruited him from Johns Hopkins to lead my leukemia group. Then he was headhunted and recruited to be the physician-in-chief at the UMass Medical Center. Again, a great job for him. And then just last week, Saad Usmani left. And Saad was the head of our myeloma or plasma cell unit, and he's gone to the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York City to head their program. And so my point is that one of the things we do here is we teach leadership so that people can go to other places and develop programs there. And I think it's a good thing. Here on the list, you can see Pete Voorhees' name, and I recruited him some years ago from Chapel Hill. He's been one of my administrative physicians in chief, and he's a myeloma expert, and he's just taken over from Saad. Mike Grunwald, who I also recruited from Johns Hopkins, has taken over from John Gerber. And I mentioned a little while ago Antoinette Tan, who's an expert on triple-negative breast cancer, and she's now the chair of the solid tumor group. So we've got really strong leadership. But we're also recruiting people who aren't leaders, who are just doctors doing the work. Don Durden is my star scientist. He came from the University of California, San Diego, bringing $6 million of funding with him. And he's an expert in developing new lymphoma drugs. He's actually commercialized one of them prior to coming here. And then Megan, Luke, and Shinu, who I've listed in blue, are people that we trained here. Dr. Jimmy Wong came from Georgetown to run a training program, and we train at any time 12 hematologic oncology specialists. We also have a training program for urological cancer surgeons. We have a training program for breast cancer surgeons, and we've recently added a palliative medicine training program and have an application in to train specialists in gynecological cancer. And as you can see, we've recruited terrific young people from all over the place. This just sort of shows you our trajectory. We've grown a lot. When my team and I arrived here, we were seeing about just under 6,000 new cases a year. And in 2019, we saw, I think it was 18,500 new cases. And last year, we actually saw 20,000 new cases. So we're in an expansion mode. We have more than 90% retention. So it means that whatever we're doing, the patients seem to be pleased with it. So, and that just quickly summarized the fact that we are busy. I did want to show you and that's sort of all the accreditations that we have. We have not yet sought National Cancer Institute designation. I'll come back to what that means in a minute. This just shows you what happens when a patient comes in to be treated by us. They come into the system, we register them, we then get their pathology reviewed, their x-ray reviewed, we take a look at whether they're eligible for clinical trials. And before he left, my colleague Ed Kim in collaboration with Mike Salvino. Some of you might know Michael. He's here in Charlotte, and he was at the time the deputy CEO of the Accenture digital tech company. He's now the head of DXC. So Michael and his team and our team developed an electronic system that allows us to standardize our care throughout our branches. And this just shows you what the doctors can see. So this one is an example of what we do with lung cancer. The little green beakers alert our doctors to the fact that there is a trial that's open, identifies what specimens need to be taken, what genes can be targeted. And if you see on the left there, this whole thing will download onto a laptop. So you can be sitting in Whiteville, North Carolina, and have access to this and be a doctor in a very small area, but getting the sort of quality of care from a main university style place. This is our discovery platform. And so each time we look at a tumor, we actually look at the gene expression profiling. We look at whether there are diagnostic tests that need to be done and new targeted therapies that we can actually implement. And here is just a graphic representation of the fact that we've done something pretty unique in this area, which is we've created a molecular tumor board. And what that means, and so we've done more than 1,000 cases like this, we actually have a team of scientists and clinical doctors who get together every week to look at the odd gene changes in tumors and then get together and start to talk about how we can target those genes. We are one of the biggest accruers to a national study run by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is a study that looks at matching these expensive targeted therapies to gene abnormalities. And what's so cool about it is the society organized with the pharmaceutical industry to provide free drug. So a drug that might cost $500,000 if you get involved in one of these trials, you actually get it free of charge. And so that's actually been a game changer for this reason. I don't have time to go through all the sort of work we're doing, but this just sort of shows you the range of areas we're interested in. And I'll just show you quickly a few key points. Our hematological malignancy group or blood cancer group have become national and international leaders in the treatment of plasma cell disorders, lymphoma, and marrow transplant. And I mentioned Saad has just gone to Sloan Kettering to be the chief of the service there. We've got top 1% of national figures in bone marrow transplants. And the CAR T concept is a new one, which is a clever way that the hematologist can turn on the immune system. And Duke University Medical Center and we are the two centers that have really done this in this state. And we're closing in on our 100th case. Our results have been terrific. And I just also want to mention, we now have a very focused program on sickle cell disease, which is a non-cancerous problem, mostly in the Black community. And then Marianne came from Wake Forest some years ago and set up a national hemophilia center here in Charlotte. In the past, people had to go to other cities to get their hemophilia managed. We have a big commitment to supportive oncology. The lovely Bevy Hemby was kind enough to give us a chair, the first one in the USA, to do all of these things. We look after the hearts that sometimes get damaged by either the cancer or its treatment. Some of you will know Sam Zimmern. Sam and Emily are members of our community, and Sam is an incredibly distinguished cardiologist, and he heads up our cardio-oncology service. He actually wanted to retire. Emily begged me to not let him retire because he'd go bonkers. And so now he plays golf 4 or 5 days a week and then comes and helps cardiac patients in the cancer center 1 day a week. And then we have other domains that I'll talk about. I will comment, we have a wonderful acupuncturist, Jonathan Polsky. Dale and Larry Polsky are members of our community, and John is an absolute sweetheart. Technically, the thought of actually having someone sticking needles in you gives me the creeps, but I've talked to many of his patients, and he's just amazing. People don't even know that the needles are in. And so that's been really important. And we do psychological support. We do rehab for patients who've lost limbs or had their breast removed. Then we have a big genetic counseling service. So these are all things that people had to leave town for in the past but they're all available here. And then a lot of this is done by telemedicine. So our genetic counseling services extend to all 25 branches. It just means that people don't have to visit us. We have found that having cancer is tough. People don't know the words, they don't understand the tests. So what we've done is we've hired 45 oncology nurses who are at the more experienced end of things, and they act as kind of navigators, or, it's like when a ship moves into an unfamiliar port, you'll get a navigator, or in this case, a pilot from the local port that'll help them not run aground. So these navigators, and I've summarized all the areas in this little thing where they work, they basically act as a liaison. They'll help patients in terms of figuring out how to do things. Unfortunately, some physicians talk gobbledygook because they're really scientifically focused. The navigators will be able to say what he just said is, and that sometimes is helpful. We actually did a look to see whether navigation mattered. And this is a survival plot that actually shows that if you have navigation, it gives you better survival outcomes, in addition to helping you adhere to treatment better, better quality of life, many things like that. I think we're pretty good community citizens. My outreach team, led by Melissa Wheeler, who's a social worker with health training, has served 68,000 people a year in the community for the last several years. We educate, we screen. When COVID came on, we felt that the risk benefit to people bringing them in to be screened wasn't there. So instead, we used our screening units to help address food insecurity in the community. We've developed an outreach program to our first responders. I was watching the consequences of the World Trade Center and discovered that so many people, so many firefighters and cops had developed cancer and various other conditions. So we actually reached out to the North Carolina firefighter community and have developed educational programs. It turns out that these guys go out heroically to fires and they take their little coats off that you can see there in the cartoon. They often have all sorts of cancer-causing substances on them. They need to wash them down. They may need to be sure that their wives aren't doing it. They need to wear masks. And so we've actually educated more than 3,000 of them. We've also developed, because we discovered that they get head and neck cancer, so we've screened so far 195 and found one head and neck cancer. We've done skin cancer checks and found a bunch. So basically, we're working with the firefighter community to help them. That's one example of our outreach program. Another one, which is my own project, is with some funding from Leon and Sandra Levine and the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation. We're able to get 2 mobile units. I've shown you a picture of one of the units up in the top left, and below the picture is what the CAT scanner looks like inside that van. In the center, you can actually see, I thought it might be interesting to you, a picture of a CAT scan. And a CAT scan is as if I cut through your lungs sort of horizontally, and you can see the blackish areas are basically the way lungs should look. The white little bits are blood vessels extending out through the lungs. In the center is the heart. But look at the top right of this CAT scan, and you can see a cigarette pack with about 8 cigarettes left. And so this approach, we know, will allow us to diagnose lung cancer early. So we set this up for people without health insurance and people who are isolated from medical care. We've now reported at a national meeting our first 1,200 subjects. They're all uninsured or underinsured, 20% of Black American, 78% rural poor. And here's the interesting thing. Of the 1,200, so far, because we've been running the program for about 4 years, we have found 30 lung cancers. This population, isolated and uneducated, never show up early. They only come with advanced cancer. And yet, of the 30 that we found 21 early cancers that we've treated with curative intent. We also found a bunch of heart disease conditions, and we've sent them off to be treated. And if you actually do the math, we've saved the community for this small population more than $4 million, because we're treating for cure and we're not treating metastatic disease that's spread throughout the body. And now with the Sanger Heart and Vascular Institute led by Dr. Jeff Rose, we're actually soon to do a program with the Catawba Indian tribe where we will be screening them for heart disease and cancer and managing that early. I think when you're managing underserved populations, it's not enough just to do good works. You actually have to measure them. And this is a summary of some work that A. Hugh, who was one of my young physicians recruited from MD Anderson Cancer Hospital, and her boss, Nilanjan Ghosh, who came from Johns Hopkins. They're part of the lymphoma unit. We call them lymphomaniacs. And the lymphoma team compared our poor Black patients with our wealthy white patients and found, in fact, that we have identical survival. I've got a survival plot there on the right, and you can see they basically have identical survival. And the survival figures, because I've rated MD Anderson, the Cleveland Clinic, and Johns Hopkins so heavily, so we have access to their data, superimposable on the best cancer centers in the country. So that's really getting true equity. It's not just that we talk about it, we're actually getting survival figures that are terrific in a population that normally do poorly. So this quickly summarizes what we did in the first 4 years. We sort of set the system up and developed a bunch of initiatives. And then in the second 5 years, we've actually matured. And so you can see we've got 26 branches. We've developed a mechanism to do first-in-man trials. Some of the studies we do haven't been done anywhere in the world. We've been in a position to actually be part of launching new drugs for melanoma, lymphoma, breast cancer, and malignant myeloma. Whereas in the past, we had tumor-specific teams just for the common cancers. And what that means is surgeons, radiation people, medical oncologists, pathologists, and nurses, all with a specialty in a particular tumor like lung cancer or colon cancer or breast cancer. Now we have them for all the different cancers. We run national education courses. We've got research funding, and we've basically bought a university quality cancer system that spreads across North Carolina, the northern part of South Carolina, and now we've started in Georgia. I personally think, my wife is a real estate broker. Dial 1-800-JUDY Raghavan if you want to sell your house. She's really good at it, and she's quite attractive and really quite personable, except when she's in a bad mood, but she's never in a bad mood with her customers. So I think from Judy, I've had a big impact. I've brought 100+ people with reasonable incomes to this area. So I personally am waiting for my award from the Real Estate Institute, but it has yet to come. And it's probably because of the conflict of interest with Judy being part of it. But I've just summarized here all the different resources that my team have brought here. I'll talk in a minute about something very exciting, the proton beam, which I'll come back to in just a moment. So, cutting healthcare costs, I think that's really important. It's a message I want you to be thinking about. We can't continue to have a country that is the most expensive for healthcare. And so doing the sorts of things that we do here, skimming is a bad thing. You know, the Mayo Clinic does that. It's a brilliant place, but very hard to get to the Mayo Clinic without insurance, whereas we take everybody. And we manage everybody, and we publish data on everybody. One of the things that I think is interesting that I do want to tell you about, because it's unique, is the Financial Toxicity Tumor Board. And that's something that we just published recently, and the 2 reviewers for the Journal of Oncology Practice commented that they'd never heard of this concept before. What it is we encourage patients to let us know if they're getting into financial trouble, and then we manage it for them. We help them get it figured out. We'll get them insurance. We'll fight the insurance companies on their behalf. Sometimes we'll find that we can get them into a trial that will get them free drug. And in 2019, we saved out-of-pocket expenses for our patients of $55 million. And in 2020, $60 million. And I gather that several other cancer centers have started this approach. The future, I've just summarized there. I am not someone with a crystal ball, so I don't know exactly how it's going to go. What I would say is that as we go forward, we anticipate great benefit from integrating with the Wake Forest Medical School. Gene Woods has developed the first part of the Charlotte Innovation Corridor, and we're doing a lot of inventing here. So we think that's going to be exciting. And then we've got a new type of radiation equipment, which deposits all the energy actually into the cancer and avoid some of the side effects of radiation. And we anticipate opening a new proton beam. I think it'll be the first in this region, and we'll open that towards the end of next year or maybe the beginning of 2023. As I mentioned when I started, I'm an old geezer, and I'm going to retire, and so we'll have some new blood with a bunch of new ideas. So I had thought I might talk a little about COVID, but I had thought about it. Everybody's sick of COVID, and I think I'd rather use the time to answer any questions, so I'll stop right there. Michael, I think you're talking, but you're muted. Michael, your mute button is on. Michael Norman. So does anybody have a question?
Yeah, this is Bob Wolf. Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the medical school that's coming to Charlotte and what that's going to mean?
Yep. So we're in the process of figuring out what that'll look like. At one point, there was discussion of having an independent medical school within the Wake Forest family, but I think that's changed now. And the thinking is that we will have a common dean. Actually, common isn't probably the right word because it makes Julianne Freischlag sound less than extraordinary. So a shared dean who will run both campuses, and we'll have a single curriculum, and then we'll have medical students who can choose to be down here or up at Winston-Salem. I think it's fair to say we're a bit bigger. We have been a teaching campus for UNC Chapel Hill for many years. And so this will just allow Wake Forest to expand. There'll be some additional scientists provided in the innovation corridor. I think we start taking students next year. We have, because we're so big, we can actually finish up the training of our UNC Chapel Hill final class while we take in our new Wake Forest class. The senior leadership down here who are interested in medical education will be part of the group of professors and associate professors and so on. And my guess is they'll be hiring some additional folks. The actual definition of will there be a chief of, say, cardiology here and a chief of cardiology at Winston-Salem, we're still figuring that out. But basically, we'll be operating next year and would anticipate continued expansion. We may do some things a little differently here. So with a very large innovation corridor right next door, we may teach some of our doctors more about new drug development and so on. The Levine Cancer Institute puts between 1,000 and 2,000 patients a year into cancer trials. So we're pretty nicely set up to help be at the forefront of developing new anti-cancer treatments, Bob. And so it'll be kind of an interplay of educating physicians, doing research, trying to provide the best high quality care that we can.
Others?
Dr. Raghavan, I have a question for you. And thanks, today was really informative. I've been reading about the new development of URSO for estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. I'm curious if that's something on which you have knowledge yet or any thoughts?
Yeah, I have to be honest and say I'm not a breast cancer expert myself. I tend to be fairly conservative, so we're waiting to see more information. I like to have, because the results of breast cancer care are now pretty good. We've been able, as you know, Maggie, to reduce the aggressiveness of surgery with safety. We've been able to work out genetic prediction of whether you need or don't need chemotherapy. And so I think there are a number of new agents that act on the axis between the brain and the ovaries and the breasts, so addressing how hormones interface with nascent cancers. And so I think it's an area that we're looking at particularly. I know that Antoinette Tan and the physicians that she's recruited to her team, which is a mix of people who were already in Charlotte, like Lane Hellner and Wendy Brick and others that she's brought from other centers, they're all actually looking at this at the moment. I don't have enough personal knowledge to make a recommendation on whether it's going to work or not.
That's fair, thank you.
Sandy Altschuler has asked, how differently will physicians be trained in the new medical school with regard to cancer prevention? Well, our dean here, Mary Hall, has been very, very interested in both outreach, prevention, and setting up appropriate training for rural medicine. And so she's been working on what the new curriculum could look like. I think we're still in the situation of kind of figuring out with the Wake Forest crew, who are also very expert, who's going to take leadership there. And so I think the answer is our approach to the medical school will be more creative, perhaps, than some of the traditional schools, without losing the things that make good doctors at a technical level. So there'll be a bigger emphasis on self-learning, a bigger emphasis on family and patient support. Another question, is there a difference in care and remuneration provided by those plans as compared to regular Medicare supplemental plans? Yeah, I have to say, I can't answer that fully. I think the way I would say it is, there are really terrific plans and some really awful plans. And the key is to get advice from someone who understands the construction of healthcare plans before you sign up. There are plans that will give you great care with a minimum of copay, and there are plans that say we're cheaper than everyone else, but you need to read the fine print because the costs come when you actually get sick. So I'm not in a position to tell you which is the best. I think if you're struggling with this, contacting the Department of Health or the Federal Department of Health, the Medicare agencies will generally tell you things like, you can ask, which are the health insurance companies that have the most complaints? Which are the health insurance companies that come up in messages about being tough to deal with? And so you'll be able to kind of navigate that way. What we do here for our patients is, I've got 10 financial counselors, and they're part of the financial toxicity tumor conference that I mentioned. And they will often talk to patients about the plans they have, how to deal with them. One of the ways we help patients is we actually check their contracts before we give chemotherapy, so that we know that they're covered, that they're not going to get a surprise bill. It still happens occasionally, I have to be honest, but we're working towards minimizing surprises, because that's a bad thing if you're fighting cancer, to have financial issues. Donna has asked if I see patients. Yes, I do. I see patients as a volunteer at the Veterans Administration Hospital here in Charlotte, and my area of expertise is bladder and prostate and testicular cancer. I don't do consultation because I'm not an expert on everything. So looking at the clock, it is 12:02. And many of you folks have much better things to do than hang around listening to me. So I perhaps should hand back to either Bob Weiss or Michael Norman.
Well, Derek, this has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'm sure I can speak for everybody who was on the call. These are very exciting times, and the future holds great promise. We're really pleased that you're here. And I can tell the group that from personal exposure to the Levine Cancer Institute, since Dr. Raghavan has come, I have had the opportunity to go elsewhere, particularly because of my academic background and my connections with a lot of places that had a better reputation over a longer time. I was very pleased that I stayed. And the care was absolutely on target, and everything that he said, I was exposed to. So thank you very much for coming.
Pleasure. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.